The 1960s was a decade of great cultural and personal change. The influences of the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and feminism quickly were reflected in the way women, particularly young women, dressed. The 1950s was a time of mass conformity and firm, limited expectations for women. The mothers portrayed in the popular television programs were always perfectly put together, wearing pearls, high heels, and well-starched dresses, even while they served breakfast to their families. Women, whether they were white or black, often made great efforts to alter their natural features to adapt to a popular ideal of feminine beauty. White women often slept with their hair in curlers or would have home perms, that is, chemical treatments for the hair so that it would have the right wave or tight curls that were fashionable. African American women, on the other hand, were expected to chemically treat their hair so it would appear sleek and straight. Newspapers and magazines with predominantly African American readers, such as the Amsterdam News, ran ads featuring wigs that were styled straight to resemble Caucasian women's hairdo. No alternative presented to represent styles for naturally curly hair. Even after the civil rights movement was at its peak in the mid-60s, the ads for wigs were still promoting a white style of hairdo. This reveals that, even as the civil rights movement was empowering and strengthening the African American community to assert themselves, fashion was still dictating that white-styled hair was the most attractive, acceptable, and desirable. The 1960s began with a similar mindset as the 1950s, but with a greater emphasis on youth, as represented by Jacqueline Kennedy, who was only 31 years old when she became First Lady and moved into the White House in January 1961. While Mrs. Kennedy had enormous influence on women's sense of style and dress, her look retained the bouffant hairdo, knee-length dresses, and matching hats and gloves that were still considered essential to a well-dressed woman. Through the early 1960s, a woman's personal comfort was often sacrificed to achieve the popular standard of beauty. High-heeled shoes and constraining undergarments such as girdles, stockings, and garter belts were part of a woman's regular wardrobe. It wasn't until the mid-1960s that the idea of the social movements began to take hold. Women's wardrobes and their appearance changed radically. The new wave of feminism that was to develop would take its cues from the other protest movements and from cultural influences from music and the arts. Feminism and fashion are sometimes at odds. Other times, fashion can be a valuable expression of feminist ideals. As much as fashion trends encouraged conformity in the 1960s and 1970s, fashion became a powerful vehicle for defiant self-expression and rejection of the status quo.
Multiculturalism at the time, and we started to stand up for ourselves and for the oppressed people of this country. So I was very much part of that movement. I marched on Washington, I burned my bra.
The feminist movement encouraged women to seek comfort and freedom of movement and free expression in how they dressed. Feeling more empowered, women began to question the status quo in all areas of their life, including fashion. Instead of conforming to ideals set by gender stereotypes, either to be ladylike or sexually desirable as seen in the movies, women started to explore their own style. By the mid-60s, the mod influence from London would dominate the fashion world in the United States as well. British designer Mary Quant created the miniskirt, and soon women's skirts and dresses were routinely worn with hemlines several inches above the knee. The miniskirt challenged the notion that women should be outwardly reserved in their appearance. With the more revealing outfits and the new emphasis on comfort, garter belts and stockings became passé, and pantyhose became the new fashion statement for women's legwear. By 1970, pantyhose had outsold traditional women's stockings, and that trend has never reversed itself. Bodywear was now made from softer fabrics that were revealing curves. At the same time, both vintage clothing and unisex dressing became very popular. Both women and men wore bell-bottom jeans, embellished t-shirts, and love beads. The young British model Twiggy became a sensation, even though, or perhaps because, her short haircut and wreathed-in figure was a departure from the 1950s idea of feminine glamour. She once said, "I want to continue and try and break the barrier between male and female. If you want to do that, that's fine. At our shows, it's like a Halloween party, which isn't a bad thing. I like to see more of it, actually." These fashion statements are shown in the Mod Fashion Show in 1970 in London. The first few models were wearing professional suits, but the skirts still show their thighs, saying that you can bring this revolution to everyday culture too. Another model showed off the pantsuit, illustrating that women can lead professional lives.
And even wearing pants to work was a very big deal back in the 60s, late 60s and early 70s. Women had to argue to wear pants to work. Who would think it? You don't even remember a day when women couldn't wear pants, but we couldn't wear pants to work. I remember getting a note from Betsy Blackwell when I wore pants one day into the office. Betsy Blackwell was the editor-in-chief of Mademoiselle, and she wrote me a note that said, "I look askance at pants."
Women's makeup in the 1960s and 1970s was tilting towards a more natural look, although the trend to freely express oneself could be seen in more marked, dramatic makeup as well. Feminists were split over the use of makeup, and while some women rejected it outright, other women continued with its use with greater flexibility and focus on a natural appearance. Women began to wear their hair more loosely, with allowances for its natural growth and texture. Hairdos were styled either very short or long and lanky. For African Americans, the civil rights movement, even more than feminism, led to changes in their fashion sense. Through the early 1960s, African American men, as well as women, chemically straightened their hair to resemble the white man's singular standard of attractiveness. Now, as they found their voices through the Black Power movement and assertions that black is beautiful, fashion took note that dark skin and naturally curly afros are attractive and desirable too. For many African American men, afros replaced the conch, a hairstyle whose name was derived from congoline, a hair straightening gel that was applied to straighten curly hair. The afro became a symbol of pride and freedom for men and women because it gave African Americans a socially acceptable way to embrace their ethnicity. White Americans were also influenced by this development of ethnic pride among African Americans, and they too began to style their hair according to its natural textures. By the 1970s, hairdos appeared to be simpler, natural, and free, much like that era. Toward the end of the 1960s, women started to feel proud of themselves and were not eager to conform to a fixed idea of what others wanted them to be. We see this in the popularity of Aretha Franklin's 1967 recording of the song Respect. The song, written in 1965 by Otis Redding, was reinterpreted by Franklin to become an anthem for many, celebrating a strong woman who knows her own worth and demands respect from her partner. All I'm asking for is a little respect. Women started to stand up for themselves as well when challenged and singled out based upon their apparel. A 1968 popular song, Harper Valley PTA, sold millions of copies. It celebrated a single mother answering back to her neighbors who say, "Mrs. Johnson, you're wearing your dresses way too high. It's been reported you've been drinking and running around with men and going wild. And we don't believe you ought to be bringing up your little girl this way." Even though they still judged her in the song, the single mom stood up for herself and came to the PTA meeting in a miniskirt to prove them wrong. The 1970s took women's fashion in an extremely different direction. Women began to wear high platform shoes and long, loosely flowing maxi skirts that reached their mid-calves or sometimes even skimmed their ankles. Miniskirts were still popular, but with maxi skirts, women had a fashionable choice that did not require them to be so revealing. Unisex dressing remained popular in the 1970s. This signified that women were now eager to have more options, including the option to wear slacks or trousers. They would never again be limited to only a wardrobe of dresses and skirts. Working women also popularized form-fitting trousers or pantsuits. This was a radical departure from decades of tradition that held that women wore pants generally only out of necessity for a particular work activity or in a most casual setting. Women, however, did not wear pants in the corporate workplace until the late 1960s. Society's opinion about women wearing pants in the most social situations evolved from the 1960s through the 1970s. The idea of a well-dressed woman in pants was, at first, only accepted in large cities, but resistance remained in most other venues. Fashion designer Yves Saint Laurent popularized pantsuits for fashionable women in 1966, and Life magazine recognized this development as an indication that women now had endless choices in deciding what to wear. By 1968, pantsuits were popular with women, and slowly it became more acceptable for women to show up in public social arenas wearing what they wanted, including pants. In just 2 decades, women's fashion completely shifted. This shift reflected the changes in the way that women thought of themselves and related to others. As the mid-1960s evolved into the 1970s, women called for fundamental changes in their personal and professional lives. They sought greater freedom of expression through the clothing and their activities. They stood up for what they believed in, and in return, they achieved an entirely new way of life.
Somebody came out and said the skirts are long. Everybody threw out their short skirts and bought the long skirt. Then, while I was there, sort of a small revolution happened. That generation of fashion left the magazine, and a new generation came in, which was talking about personal style, which was you do your thing, I do my thing. The whole idea is to find the best thing that works for us. So I was in another transition. I'm a transition person.